There was once a young man in high school. He was a senior. His grades were decent, but not amazing. His family didn't have much money to send him to college with. So if he was going to be able to go to college right after high school, he would have to get an academic scholarship. Getting one of those scholarships wasn't too difficult in theory. You would just have to get a high enough score on a standardized test, either the ACT or SAT. Those tests were offered multiple times throughout his time in high school, and he could take the test multiple times. His best score could then be used to get a scholarship. But this young man didn't take the test multiple times. In fact, he hardly thought about it at all. Towards the very end of his senior year, he realized that he was running out of time to take the test. So he signed up for the test at the very last moment he could possibly have taken it. He had all his hopes pinned on this one test he was going to take. And on the morning of the test, the young man woke up with a fairly serious head cold. He couldn't focus. His head felt so heavy that he could barely hold it up. You know the feeling. Well, this seriously affected his performance on the test. And as he awaited the results from the ACT test he took, he thought about how wonderful it would be to be able to go to college with at least a partial scholarship. Then the day came. His results were mailed to him. And as he opened up the envelope and began to scan the results, he was shocked to find out that he did not have a good enough score to get the scholarship. The ACT is broken up into different subjects, and he missed qualifying for a scholarship by just 1 point on the math section of the ACT. Surely, he lamented, if he did not wait until the last minute to take his test, if he took the test multiple times, and if he didn't get this head cold, he probably would have had a good enough grade to get a scholarship. And what was this young man's problem? He was a procrastinator. He waited until the last minute and scrambled to take the test as time was running out. He was not prepared. Well, today we are going to discuss a spiritual kind of procrastination, and I hope that by the end of today's sermon you will be motivated to take your spiritual life a little bit more seriously. As you remember, we are in Matthew 25 as we had closed out the 24th chapter last week. Jesus is discussing the end of the world, and he is using parables to do so here in chapter 25. So let's begin then in verses 1 to 4, as we will consider a few ideas regarding procrastination in general. Verses 1 to 4 say this: "The kingdom of heaven will be like 10 virgins who took their lamps and went to meet the bridegroom. 5 of them were foolish, and 5 were wise. For when the foolish took their lamps, they took no oil with them, but the wise took flasks of oil with their lamps." I think the immediate question that springs into our minds when reading this passage is about the context of the story. What do the virgins have to do with the story? And why do they need lamps and oil for the lamps? Well, we'll get into that in our next section, but for right now, you just have to accept that they're virgins that need oil for their lamps. I'll explain the rest in a bit. It'll make sense in a bit, but just accept that they need oil for their lamps. First, however, we must discuss preparation, which is really the opposite of procrastination. By looking at the text, we can determine that not all of the virgins were prepared. Only half of them took what they needed, the oil. What we can determine from this is that preparation is not popular. Let's go back to the young man in high school. He didn't want to prepare for the ACT or SAT. He was out doing fun things. He was busy with sports and music and hanging out with friends. He was having a good time. He thought those kids who spent time studying were nerds. He rolled his eyes at those kinds of kids and their careful study. That's how most people are about spiritual things as well, unfortunately. When you tell someone about the gospel and about how they will be held accountable for their sins, they brush it off. Some people say that they'll start taking spiritual things more seriously later on in life. Maybe you have encountered such a response. I have. The thing is, people are not promised another breath in this life. So putting off spiritual matters is quite dangerous. It is evident then that being prepared is a key to having success. This is both true in everyday matters and in your spiritual life. If you would like to have a good standing in your next life, you need to prepare in this life. Notice that those who prepare are considered wise, and those who did not prepare are considered foolish. Jesus often divides people into two categories in his discourses, those who go to heaven and those who go to hell. This parable is no different. The story leaves us with a sense of what is at stake: eternity. We will see that as we continue on with the story. But let me point out one last thing. Those who are prepared understand what is at stake. If the young man who waited to take his test knew how much he would be missing out on, knew how much missing out on the scholarship would set him back, he surely would have taken the whole thing more seriously, don't you think? Now then, we have talked about preparation. What happens when the event that you were preparing for finally starts? This is what we see in verses 5 to 9. Now, before I move on, let's take a look at the context of this parable. This story is about a wedding and the moments right before the wedding takes place. D.A. Carson puts it this way, quote, "Normally, the bridegroom, with some close friends, left his home to go to the bride's home, where there were various ceremonies, followed by a procession through the streets after nightfall to his home. Then the 10 virgins may be bridesmaids who have been assisting the bride, and they expect to meet the groom as he comes from the bride's house. Everyone in the procession was expected to carry his or her own torch. Those without a torch would be assumed to be party crashers or even brigands. The festivities, which might last several days, would formally get underway at the groom's house." End quote. So the groom leaves his house, goes to the bride's house, takes her back to his house for the wedding. And along the way, these virgins or young maidens or bridesmaids, if you will, join the procession. And it's one big procession back to the wedding. So the virgins, or young girls, would be waiting for the groom to arrive. They didn't know when he would arrive. It would be after nightfall. So they had to wait around for him. Now, with that in mind, let's take a look at the text again. Verse 5 begins by saying, "As the bridegroom was delayed, they all became drowsy and slept. But at midnight there was a cry, 'Here is the bridegroom. Come out to meet him.' Then all those virgins rose and trimmed their lamps. And the foolish said to the wise, 'Give us some of your oil, for our lamps are going out.' But the wise answered, saying, 'Since there will not be enough for us and for you, go rather to the dealers and buy for yourselves.'" So this is the part of the sermon where I explain to you the symbolism of the parable and what is represented. The virgins represent humans, both wise and foolish. The lamps represent their souls. And the oil is the gospel message and Christianity itself, which lights up the soul, spiritually speaking. The gospel spreads spiritual light and allows people to see. We might say then that those who know Jesus are like the wise virgins, and they kept their lamps trimmed. What does that phrase in verse 7 mean, though? It says, "Then all those virgins rose and trimmed their lamps." Do you ever trim a lamp? I never have. Maybe you have, I haven't. One commentator explains this phrase this way. He says, "They trimmed them, the lamps, by removing the burnt parts of the linen or the torch so that they would burn clear. It was needful also to dip them again in oil or to pour oil upon them. They would cut away what is burnt and not useful so that the torch would burn with less smoke. And then you might need to apply some more oil. It's like this. Mankind, in its first state, was righteous. Adam and Eve were in the garden and they had no sin. But since the fall, man needs something so that his soul may be illuminated. People come to the end of their lives and their souls are dim. They have no righteousness of their own. Their life has been lived in sinfulness and their life has gone out. Only those with the oil of the gospel can hope to join the groom's wedding party. And speaking of the groom, I'm sure you can guess that the groom represents Christ and the wedding feast represents heaven. The groom takes the wedding party back to his home. Well, Christ's home is in heaven, isn't it? It's fitting that this talks about heaven. We've seen this kind of imagery before. Back in Matthew 22, we covered the parable of the wedding feast. If you remember that parable, you will recall those without proper wedding clothes were not welcome at the wedding. In the same way, in this parable, those without the oil of the gospel will not be allowed into heaven. So the virgins fell asleep in the story, and they were waiting around for the groom. And they dozed off. He came about midnight, so you understand why they fell asleep. The groom was delayed. And arriving around midnight was a bit later than usual for this custom. I believe that the sleep in this story represents death. But commentators are divided on this. However, I think it makes sense for the slumber in this story to be death, as after you die, you will have no opportunity to turn to Christ in faith and be saved. You need to make preparations in this life. Both the wise and the foolish virgins fell asleep, and both Christians and non-Christians die. Christians have been waiting for Christ to come back for nearly 2,000 years. Almost all of them have fallen to the slumber of death, and only a few are awake at the moment, people like us who are alive. But all people, believers or not, will arise in the end. They will have their lamps, that is, their souls, evaluated. Those with lamps burning for Christ will be brought to heaven. As I mentioned, there will be no time to fix any past procrastination. The foolish virgins in verse 8 needed some oil, as the flames of their lamps had faded. The wise virgins, with oil, could not give oil to the foolish virgins, just as Christians cannot give Christ's righteousness to unbelievers. Those who do not know God must enter heaven by the narrow gate. That is, they must enter heaven by turning to Christ in faith. This is why the wise virgins told the foolish virgins, in essence, go buy some oil for yourselves. So the wise virgins have their oil, and their lamps are trimmed and shining brightly. The foolish ones are scrambling to try to get ready, but there is no time left. So what's the outcome of the story? Verses 10 to 12 tell us, they say, and while they were going to buy, the bridegroom came, and those who were ready went in with him to the marriage feast, and the door was shut. Afterward, the other virgins came also, saying, Lord, Lord, open to us. But he answered, truly I say to you, I do not know you. The foolish virgins are now trying to buy some oil, but then the groom swings by and takes those who are ready with him. They went to his home, and the door was shut behind them. The closed door is a picture of being shut out of heaven. The foolish virgins come back and plead to get in, but the groom does not let them in. They say, Lord, Lord, open to us. But he says, truly, I say to you, I do not know you. This is unmistakably a reference to heaven. And we know this because Jesus says so in verse 1. If you remember, he started by saying, then the kingdom of heaven will be like. But we can also say that we know this is about heaven because of what Christ said in Matthew 7. The words in Matthew 7 and the words here in Matthew 25 are extremely similar. Jesus said in Matthew 7, "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter the kingdom of heaven, but the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. On that day, many will say to me, 'Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and cast out demons in your name, and do many mighty works in your name?' And then I will declare to them, 'I never knew you. Depart from me, you workers of lawlessness.'" What are the similarities between these two passages? Well, both instances see people trying to get into heaven by saying, "Lord, Lord." And both are told that the Lord does not know them. Not to say that God is unaware of their existence, but that he does not have a close relationship with them. Finally, we are issued a warning. Verse 13, "Watch, therefore, for you know neither the day nor the hour." And this is the takeaway from the message. This is the application of it all. This verse tells us how you can make this parable, how you can take this parable and have it make an impact in your life, and how you can walk away from this text with something practical. We have both a command and a reason behind the command in this verse. And the command is simple. Watch. We are to keep watch for the groom. We are to be prepared for his coming. That is, we need to prepare for Christ's return. We must shake off the chains of spiritual procrastination and get ready. How can we do this? Well, first, it seems obvious, we need to have the oil of the gospel. Our own obedience is not enough to make our souls shine with a bright flame of righteousness. It is only the life of Christ applied to our own souls that will make us acceptable before God and grant us access to heaven. To put it plainly, one must first trust their life to Christ. They must become a Christian. They must follow Christ. Unfortunately, some people haven't spent more than a few minutes of their entire lives thinking about their souls. People put off looking into what the Bible says about salvation and spiritual truth. They live their lives seeking out what they find to be important without ever considering things of eternal weight, eternal importance. But, you might say, I'm already a Christian. What does this mean for me? Well, my friends, Christianity is not like an easy retirement. It's not as if your life should be spent in leisure once you've become converted. Your life as a Christian should be marked by work and devotion to the things of God. Just as the virgins trimmed their wicks of their lamps to remove what was burnt and not useful, so that the flame would burn more clearer, we too should focus on burning cleaner and brighter. We should work by the Spirit's help to remove things in our lives that should not be there. Some people, I fear, sit in church every week and do not consider their lives. They never recognize things in their lives that needs to be removed or changed. Their sin is never dealt with, and their flame is mixed with a lot of impurities, which causes smoke. Their flame does not burn clean. But as God works in our hearts, he begins to prune away impurities and allows us to focus on what we should do. The Christian begins to love and not hate, to uplift and not tear down, and starts working for God's kingdom and stops pursuing his own desires. More and more, the Christian begins to submit himself to Christ. Why should we do this? Why does it matter? We're given a reason. For you know neither the day nor the hour. You don't know when Christ will come back. He could come back at any time. He could come back in this very moment. You may be awake when he returns, or you may fall asleep while watching. That is, you may die before he returns. But make sure that you are prepared for when he does arrive. It would be such a terrible thing to be shut out of heaven when the groom arrives. And it would also be an awful thing to be at the wedding feast with a very small light. That is, a very inconsistent Christian life. We want to be burning brightly for Christ when he returns, don't we? Then we need to stop procrastinating and get ready. We need to realize what is at stake, and by God's help, do what needs to be done.